I woke up that morning with nothing more ambitious in mind than checking the irrigation lines that fed my grandfather's orchard. The air was already dry, the kind that makes every drop of water feel like gold. But the sight that greeted me nearly made me choke on my coffee. A glossy black Bentley SUV sprawled right across my barn gate, blocking the main water channel. And there she was, Linda. Arms folded, sunglasses glinting, wearing that smug grin that meant trouble. In a season of drought, she hadn't just parked badly, she'd declared open war. My name is David, a 49-year-old retired irrigation engineer who chose to settle on my grandfather's land. Every acre, every pipe beneath the soil, carries his legacy and my responsibility. Across the fence stood Linda, early 40s, hair of golden curls sculpted into perfection, as if each strand had been arranged by a stylist with military precision. She wore a flowing designer dress that shimmered under the sun, oversized sunglasses hiding half her face, and a thick gold bracelet that caught the light whenever she gestured. Her beauty was undeniable, but her expression radiated command, superiority, and a touch of cruelty. Linda ruled the HOA like a queen who never faced opposition. I was merely the farmer in her eyes, someone to be brushed aside. But she had no idea how wrong she was. Where would the real battle begin? It began as a nuisance, the sort of thing you think will blow over if you ignore it. Linda called one morning with a voice that tried to sound civil and landed somewhere between condescension and a summons. "Your irrigation pipes are an eyesore," she told me, as if the pipes had a vote in whether they belonged on my grandfather's land. I listened, because you listen to your neighbors, even the ones who think a mansion's fence qualifies them to legislate the countryside. I answered politely, explained that those pipes had been laid down long before any of her manicured hedges, and hoped the matter would die. It didn't. That call was the first ripple of a storm she intended to grow. A week later came the formal notice. "Noise violations," the letter said in bland type. My pumps, which hummed at dawn to pull water for saplings and seedlings, apparently disturbed Linda's meditation. I remember standing on the porch holding that paper and staring at the orchard as if it could explain itself. I had never thought of my pumps as disruptive. To me, they were a hum of life. But to her and the board she commanded, they were a nuisance to be weaponized. I went to the next HOA meeting and spoke calmly technical details, flow rates, schedules. A few heads nodded politely, then resumed their private gossip. Linda smiled, an expression that was all teeth and strategy, and turned the room against me with one well-timed aside about old ways and modern standards. I left that meeting feeling like a man who'd shown up to negotiate with, a jury that had already chosen its verdict. When direct tactics failed, the campaign shifted to the quieter, more insidious ground of gossip. She began to seed rumors. "David's wasting water," they would say in passing, and the accusation landed not as a fact but as a taint. Neighbors who'd once waved from their driveways started crossing the street to avoid me. Invitations stopped. Children who used to climb the old fence to pet my dog were suddenly told not to go near that property. I watched people I'd known for years tilt their heads away at gatherings, their eyes skimming past me to greet more fashionable faces. Linda's narrative was a slow poison. Paint me as the selfish one and everything I fought for would look selfish too. I fought back with facts, meter readings, maintenance logs, a ledger of efficient usage, but facts are clumsy weapons against a gossip machine with momentum. Her escalation escalated into theatrics. One afternoon she arrived in that glossy black SUV and parked it across my barn gate, right where the main channel ran. It was the kind of display she excelled at. Theatrical, public, impossible to ignore. I stood on the gravel with my hands on my hips while she leaned against the door as if it were a throne. "Maybe it's time you sold the place," she said, like an auctioneer lowering a gavel. People slowed as they drove by, craning to see the scandal. I remember thinking that blocking the water in a drought wasn't merely spiteful. It was a tactical move to starve the orchard into compliance. Panic had a way of infecting neighbors. Somebody called the HOA to complain about the disturbance, and another neighbor, who owed Linda favors, suggested mediation. The mediation was a performance in which I was the accused, and Linda, improbably, the wronged party. Then came the night that changed the equation from harassment to attempted destruction. I woke to the sound of rushing water under the stars and ran barefoot into mud that splattered up my legs. My main line had been sliced open somewhere upstream, a clean cut that could only have been made by someone who knew which pipe mattered most. Water gushed into the low ground, smelling of iron and urgency, while my seedlings sat thirsty in the rows beyond. I worked until my hands cramped, taping and patching with the few supplies I had, but when daylight came and the truck tracks led away, the point was obvious. This was deliberate. It was a message that said, in effect, give up. I could have called the sheriff, but evidence without witnesses is a hard case still. The list of people who benefited from my ruin narrowed with painful clarity. More subtle attacks shadowed the overt ones. Letters arrived from the county inspectors complaining about improper drainage, even though I had the original permits in a folder neatly labeled with my grandfather's signature. Someone had flagged my paperwork with the county as though my grandfather's holdings were suddenly fraudulent. Fines followed, small at first but mounted in number, each one another stitch in a noose of red tape. Then there were the anonymous notes on my truck. Sell before it's too late. Nice land shame about the owner. Small acts that carry outsized weight because intimidation feeds on repetition. Even my mailbox fell silent. No support. No offers to help, and the orchard felt lonelier with every passing week. All of this forced me to change how I moved through my days. Where once the rhythm of planting and pruning defined time, now I kept odd hours, checking traps of camera footage I had finally bought, walking property lines at dusk, listening for the soft betrayal of tires on gravel. I listened not only for Linda, but for any sign that others who stood in her orbit might act on her suggestions. There were moments, in the hollow hours before dawn, when I recognized a memory of my former life surfacing. The quiet discipline of someone who had once managed infrastructure on a scale that made farm irrigation look small. I had managed projects where entire towns depended on timing and valves. I had written protocols to protect resources from corruption and waste. Those skills had felt like relics until they became tools again, the same way frost-hardened earth can be coaxed back to yield. The slowly mounting pressure and the sudden violence of sabotage pushed me past denial into planning. I stopped treating Linda as an eccentric neighbor and began mapping her moves like a chess player tracing an opponent's pawns. I documented everything: meter readings, camera timestamps, overheard statements, and I started talking to people privately. Not everyone wanted to talk in public. Fear had made them cautious. But in quiet corners, over coffee with those who still remembered my grandfather's laugh, I found allies. A retired paralegal who kept meticulous notes. A mechanic who'd seen Linda's SUV arrive late on nights she claimed she'd been home. A woman whose fine had mysteriously doubled the same week she'd refused to sign Linda's petition. Each small testimony began to knit a counter-narrative to the one Linda had spun. By the time I reached the end of that summer's escalation, it was no longer about property lines or aesthetic standards. It was about authority misused, about a few people deciding who deserved to belong in a community. And while the attacks had bruised me, they had also sharpened the parts of me that would not yield. Linda thought she'd broken me. What she did instead was expose fault lines in her own empire. I could feel the shift coming, a gathering of quiet facts and stubborn neighbors that would force a reckoning. The orchard had been battered, yes, but it had not been defeated. And I, no longer merely a farmer on inherited land, was starting to plan how to turn the tide back toward justice. The breaking point wasn't the vandalized pipes or the fines or even the SUV blocking my gate. It was the silence of the orchard. I walked the rows one evening and realized I could hear only dry leaves scraping together in the wind. No birdsong, no frogs by the ditch, not even the low hum of pumps that had become part of my pulse. That silence was the sound of defeat, and it shook me. But it also clarified something I had avoided admitting. I could not wait for justice to stumble my way. I would have to force it into daylight. I started with evidence. Years of engineering had trained me to trust measurements, not opinions. So I mounted cameras near the reservoir, near the gates, along the fence line. Every gallon of water that left my system was logged, every hour recorded. I dug out old notebooks from my office charts and formulas for conservation ratios, calculations of output compared to rainfall. It felt obsessive, maybe even paranoid. But paranoia has its uses when you are being hunted by someone who thrives on rumor. Linda, of course, noticed the cameras within a week. She strutted past my gate one morning in her silk scarf and wide-brimmed hat, pointed at one of the small black devices on a post, and laughed. "Desperate men build ugly fences," she said loudly enough for neighbors to hear. I kept my hands in my pockets, said nothing. But inside I thought, "Keep laughing, Linda. Every day you run those sprinklers on your roses at noon, the cameras catch it. Every minute your lights blaze in 3 empty rooms, the meters record it. Facts are patient, they wait until someone listens." What I hadn't expected was an ally. Mark, her husband, was a quiet man who often trailed behind her at HOA meetings, nodding dutifully. He came to me one evening just as the sky turned violet. He parked his pickup by my barn and stepped out carrying a folder, his eyes darting as if someone might be watching. "I can't keep pretending anymore," he muttered. His hands shook as he passed me the folder. Inside were spreadsheets, bank records, copies of checks. Linda had been siphoning HOA funds for decorative projects, paving a private patio, commissioning custom landscaping, even charging luxury travel to the association account. I stared at the papers, then at him. "Why are you giving me this?" I asked. He swallowed hard. "Because she's going to burn this whole place down, David. And I don't want to go with her." There was pain in his voice, the kind that comes from years of enabling a tyrant and finally realizing the cost. I promised him anonymity for now, but I knew his testimony could be the hammer that cracked Linda's crown. At the same time, I uncovered something Linda had overlooked: zoning records. My orchard wasn't just residential property. Decades ago, my grandfather had secured a special agricultural use designation, meaning the HOA had no authority over irrigation infrastructure. Their rules applied to lawns and patios, not to farmland. The moment I reread that clause, my chest tightened with a strange mix of anger and relief. Linda had spent months parading her power in front of me, but legally she'd been standing on sand. Still, facts and loopholes alone wouldn't win. People needed to see, to feel that truth. So I prepared a case the way I once prepared technical briefs for government hearings. Binders filled with photos, Linda's sprinklers wasting water at midday, her SUV blocking the barn, the slashed pipes, charts comparing my efficient system to the neighborhood average, meter readings proving I used 1/3 the water of any other property, and then the hidden ace, documents Mark had given me, ready to be revealed when the moment burned brightest. The twist, though, wasn't in the papers. It was in me. For months I had let people believe I was a simple farmer hanging on to family land. I had nodded quietly when they dismissed me, swallowed insults, endured laughter. But the truth was, I wasn't merely someone who tinkered with valves in the dirt. I had been the chief engineer on a national water project that spanned 3 states. I had drafted conservation regulations, advised senators, stood in hearings where billions of gallons were at stake. Some of the very guidelines Linda misquoted in her HOA memos had once come across my desk for approval. I wasn't just defending my orchard, I was defending principles I had helped design. The realization gave me an odd sense of calm. When the next HOA meeting was announced, I didn't dread it. I dressed in a clean shirt, packed my binders, and walked into that community center with the quiet confidence of someone who knows the ground under his feet is solid. The room was full. Linda had rallied her followers for another performance. She wore a crimson dress that shimmered under fluorescent lights, her sunglasses perched on her head like a crown, her gold bracelet catching every flash of movement. She started with her usual monologue about community standards and irresponsible land use. People nodded, murmured approval, ready to condemn me again. Then I stood. My voice was steady, though my hands pressed the edges of the binder a little too hard. I began with data. Water usage charts, photographs, meter logs. Murmurs replaced nods. I showed video clips of her sprinklers running for hours, wasting more water in a week than I used in a month. Some gasps. I revealed the zoning documents. the agricultural designation that stripped HOA of any authority over my irrigation. A silence spread across the room. And then, slowly, I spoke the truth I had kept hidden. My career, my role in writing the very rules Linda pretended to enforce. The twist landed like a hammer. People blinked, shifted in their seats, and glanced at Linda with new suspicion. She tried to laugh it off, waving her bracelet as if to shoo away the facts. "Titles don't matter here," she snapped. "Community matters." But her voice cracked on the last word, and everyone heard it. I wasn't finished. I slid the final folder onto the table, Mark's documents. Embezzlement, misappropriation, fraud spelled out in bank statements. Linda froze. Mark himself stood at the back, face pale but resolute. He spoke, for the first time in years, not as her shadow but as a man reclaiming his spine. "It's true," he said simply. The room erupted. For the first time, the queen of the HOA found herself cornered, not by gossip or intimidation, but by truth wielded in the open. And I realized, standing there, that the tide had turned. The war Linda declared at my barn gate was about to end, not with my silence, but with her downfall. The next HOA meeting was not a meeting, it was a trial, though nobody called it that. Word had spread after my last confrontation. Neighbors whispered over fences, church groups murmured after Sunday services, and even the clerk at the local hardware store asked me what really went down between me and Linda. By the time the board convened again, the community center was standing room only. Some folks who had never cared to attend HOA affairs now sat in folding chairs, waiting for spectacle. The room smelled of dust, perfume, and anticipation. Linda entered as if she still believed the crown was hers. She wore a white blazer over her crimson dress, her golden curls set in perfect waves, her sunglasses perched high like a diadem. She carried her clipboard like a scepter, tapping it against her palm with theatrical rhythm. The board members shuffled nervously. They had begun to sense the ground shifting under them. But Linda, she strutted, smiled, and took her seat at the head of the long table, as if the universe itself awaited her command. I let her start. She launched into her speech, a familiar cocktail of disdain and authority. My reckless irrigation practices, my disregard for neighborhood standards, my constant hostility toward community improvement. Every sentence dripped with venom, and I could see some of the audience nodding automatically, conditioned by months of her propaganda. Then, at just the right moment, I stood and placed my binders on the table. The sound of that binder hitting wood was sharper than a gavel. Heads turned. I began not with accusations but with evidence. Water usage records, side-by-side comparisons showing my orchard used 1/3 the water of Linda's ornamental sprinklers. Photos of her lawn glowing like a football field under wasteful irrigation at noon. Videos of her SUV parked deliberately across my barn gate. Murmurs spread through the crowd, some sharp gasps when they realized just how blatant her hypocrisy had been. I pressed further. I opened another binder and displayed the zoning documents, my land's agricultural designation. A clause written in plain legal language stripped the HOA of any power over my irrigation system. Linda's rules had never applied. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. One even leaned back in his chair as if the floor beneath him had grown unsteady. Linda interrupted, her voice rising an octave. "This is irrelevant. Community standards are broader than paperwork." He is hiding behind technicalities. But her tone wavered, and people noticed. For years she had spoken like a queen. Now she sounded like a defendant. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply laid out the truth she had tried so hard to bury. Then I unveiled the final folder, Mark's documents. Bank statements, invoices, copies of checks diverted for decorative projects. Tens of thousands of dollars redirected into Linda's personal pleasures. The private patio, the luxury landscaping, even a trip to Miami charged to HOA funds. Gasps erupted louder than before. And then came the moment nobody expected. Mark stood. His hands trembled, but his voice was steady. "It's all true," he said. "I've watched her do it for years. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter, but it does. She's been stealing from every one of you." The room fell silent, the kind of silence that arrives just before thunder. Neighbors turned in their seats, eyes wide, jaws clenched. Betrayal stings hardest when it's personal, and these people had funded her empire with their dues. The board had no choice. They could not laugh it off, not with half the neighborhood staring daggers at them. One member stammered, We'll need to call a special review. But another cut him off, his voice suddenly bold now that the tide had turned. No, the vote tonight. Linda rose to her feet, her face red beneath her foundation. You can't do this to me, she shrieked. I built this community. Without me, you'd all still be living in dirt and weeds. Her words, once intimidating, now sounded pitiful, desperate. Some people even chuckled. The Queen was no longer majestic but absurd. The vote was swift. By overwhelming majority, Linda was removed as HOA president. A murmur of relief spread through the room like wind through dry grass. People who had feared her for years suddenly found their voices. One man stood up and recounted how Linda had fined him for having the wrong shade of paint on his shutters. A woman described how her elderly mother had been humiliated by Linda for hanging laundry to dry in her own backyard. Story after story poured out, each one a brick pulled from the crumbling tower of Linda's reign. The local paper had sent a reporter after whispers of scandal reached town. By the time the meeting adjourned, the journalist had enough material for a front-page story. Cameras flashed, pens scribbled furiously, and Linda, once the picture of authority, now looked like a cornered animal. She tried to storm out, but not before neighbors shouted after her, "Pay us back! You should be ashamed!" The sound of her heels clacking against the floor was drowned out by the roar of a community reclaiming itself. Over the next weeks, the fallout was relentless. Civil suits were filed. Bank auditors confirmed the embezzlement. Linda's accounts were frozen, and her reputation, once polished to a blinding shine, shattered into shards no designer dress could conceal. Neighbors who had once trembled before her now crossed the street not out of fear, but out of disgust. She became a pariah in the very neighborhood she once ruled. For me, the transformation was just as sharp. People began stopping me at the post office, thanking me for standing up, for showing them that truth could still win against intimidation. Invitations reappeared: potlucks, backyard barbecues, small gatherings where folks wanted to hear the whole story. I was no longer the farmer with noisy pumps. I was the man who had exposed the bully in their midst. One evening, weeks after the meeting, I walked into the orchard as the sun dipped low. For the first time in months, I heard birds again, chirping from the branches. The pumps hummed their steady song, not as a point of contention but as proof of resilience. Water flowed evenly through the channels, catching the orange glow of sunset. I stood there, boots on soil my grandfather had walked, and let myself breathe. Justice hadn't come easily, but it had come publicly, undeniably, and permanently. Linda's downfall wasn't just about me. It was about every neighbor who had lived under her thumb. The public nature of her humiliation mattered. People needed to see her stripped of power, to feel the shift from fear to freedom. And, as I looked around at faces once hardened by suspicion, now softened by relief, I realized something. Justice isn't a quiet thing. Sometimes it has to be loud enough for the whole community to hear. Linda's downfall did not arrive with a single crash, but with a slow unraveling, the kind of collapse that strips away dignity one thread at a time. At first, she tried to project her usual confidence. She still walked down her driveway in designer heels, still waved at neighbors with that dismissive flick of her hand, still spoke as though she commanded a kingdom, but people no longer lowered their eyes. They whispered when she passed, their conversations growing louder the farther she walked. When the civil suits began stacking on her doorstep, her smile grew brittle. By the time auditors traced the HOA's missing funds back to her accounts, she had lost more than money she had lost. The aura of inevitability that once kept everyone in line. The repayment order was devastating. Tens of thousands of dollars had to be returned to the association. Linda sold off jewelry. The gold bracelet that had once flashed like a weapon at every meeting vanished from her wrist. The glossy Bentley that had blocked my barn gate disappeared from her garage, sold to cover debts. She began arriving at the grocery store in a modest sedan, and even that became a subject of gossip. For someone who had built her identity on prestige, the collapse of her image was as brutal as any prison sentence. Then came the sign, a stark red and white, "For sale," planted in her immaculate lawn. I stood on my porch the morning it appeared, sipping coffee, and felt a complicated mix of relief and disbelief. I had imagined Linda would fight to the bitter end, but instead, she retreated. Perhaps even she knew that reputation, once shattered, is not easily pieced together. Prospective buyers toured the house, their children running across the polished floors Linda once guarded like sacred ground. She was never present for these visits. Neighbors whispered she had moved into a condo across town, where she could walk into stores without being recognized. But shame follows louder than any parade, and she could not escape it. When the moving truck finally rumbled away, carrying her furniture and the remnants of her reign, the neighborhood exhaled. It was as if a storm had passed, leaving fresh air in its wake. People lingered on sidewalks, chatting again. Children rode bikes without parents calling them back from Linda's glare. Gardens bloomed without fear of fines for aesthetic violations. The silence that had once smothered the neighborhood cracked, replaced by laughter, by music drifting from open windows, by a sense of freedom people had forgotten they could feel. The HOA itself changed. Without Linda at the helm, the board held emergency elections. For the first time, ballots were counted openly, votes discussed transparently. Receipts for association expenses were displayed line by line at meetings. People who had once avoided gatherings began attending, curious now that their voices mattered. A neighbor suggested planting a community garden, and instead of Linda dismissing it as unsightly, the idea was met with enthusiasm. A retired teacher proposed monthly cleanup days, and families signed up eagerly. What had once been a stage for Linda's domination transformed into a genuine forum for collaboration. I resisted when they first asked me to take a formal role. Politics was never my aim. I wanted only to tend the orchard and honor my grandfather's legacy. But neighbors insisted. "You know the land, you know the water, and you know what fairness looks like," one man told me. "We need someone like you to keep things straight." So I accepted a position as head of the new Water and Land Oversight Committee. It wasn't glamorous, there were still arguments about budgets, still disagreements about landscaping, but the difference was profound. People spoke as equals, not subjects. The orchard itself became a symbol of that shift. Once viewed as the battleground of Linda's campaign, it now stood for resilience. My irrigation lines, once mocked as unsightly, became a model of efficiency. I hosted tours, showing neighbors how little water the orchard required compared to their endless sprinklers. Children from the local school visited on field trips, running between the rows, learning how heritage and conservation could coexist. Each time I turned the valves and water flowed clean and steady, I felt a quiet vindication not just for myself, but for the principle that truth once revealed cannot be silenced again. One autumn evening, we organized a gathering at the orchard to celebrate the new chapter. Lanterns hung from branches, tables spread with food from every household, laughter carrying across the fields. People shared stories not only about Linda's tyranny, but about their relief at being free from it. Some spoke with humor, recalling her obsession with mailbox heights and hedge shapes. Others grew serious, confessing how deeply her intimidation had scarred their sense of belonging. As the night deepened, I stood at the main valve, hands steady, and opened it wide. Water surged through the channels, catching the glow of lantern light. The crowd erupted in applause. Neighbors hugged, clapped me on the back, and in that sound, the roar of water, the cheer of community I heard justice made tangible. The local newspaper covered the event, publishing photos of the orchard glowing like a festival. They called it "The Night the Water Flowed," and though the headline was dramatic, it captured something true. The orchard was no longer just my inheritance. It was our collective symbol of endurance, of what happens when people stand together against arrogance. In the following weeks, strangers from nearby communities stopped by, curious to see the farm that had toppled a tyrant. Some asked me how I had kept going. My answer was always simple: because silence would have meant surrender. Yet even in victory, I remained reflective. I walked the rows at dawn, dew glistening on leaves, and asked myself how many more Lindas were out there to people in small positions of power who used rules as weapons instead of tools. The fight here was just one battle in a larger pattern. Justice, I realized, is not a destination. It is a responsibility that must be carried forward as carefully and deliberately as water guided through channels. Sometimes, late at night, I remember the sound of Linda's voice cracking in that final meeting, the exact moment when her authority slipped beyond recovery. Not because I savor her humiliation, but because it reminds me of an eternal truth. Bullies appear invincible until the day they are not. And that day arrives when truth refuses to bow, when ordinary people decide enough is enough. So life continued. I tended the orchard, shared fruit with neighbors, chaired the committee when needed. I laughed at barbecues, told stories at potlucks, watched children race between rows their grandparents once feared to approach. But I stayed watchful, not paranoid, simply aware. Because power has a way of creeping back if left unchecked. The orchard taught me that guardianship is not passive, it is active, constant, and deeply human. And so the legacy of this fight was not just my grandfather's land preserved, nor Linda's downfall made permanent. It was the reminder etched into every channel of water, every root and branch. Justice is a living thing. It must be defended, celebrated, and carried forward. Linda may have left in disgrace, but what she left behind was a stronger, wiser community, one that would not be fooled so easily again. When I walk the orchard now, the water flowing freely at my side, I know this. The fight was never just about me. It was about us all. And because of that, the orchard will always stand, not just as farmland, but as proof that truth, when defended, can outlast any tyranny. That is the legacy worth leaving.